On Sky News Australia, this is the Rita Panahi Show Overtime.
Welcome to the Rita Panahi Show Overtime. This is our final edition for 2023 and we have a massive program for you. Joining me will be energy expert Alex Epstein to discuss COP28 and the renewed push for a carbon tax. Plus, we fact-check Hillary Clinton. Josh Hammer brings us the latest in US politics, from the border crisis to the two-tier justice system. Fresh from testifying at a congressional hearing, the great Michael Shellenberger will join me with the latest on the weaponisation of the federal government. And as always, there'll be plenty of lefties losing it. But first, let's start with the latest news stories with Sky News contributor Prue McSween. Prue, this is a worrying development. In the midst of a war, Israel is warning its citizens against travelling to Australia and about 80 other countries over fears they could face anti-Semitism. Travellers are urged to exercise increased precaution. I've got to say, this is pretty disturbing as an Australian to be lumped in with a bunch of other countries that are virulently anti-Semitic, but we can't deny some of the scenes we have seen on the streets, the chants we saw at the Opera House, the hostility towards the Jewish community.
Who can blame them, as you say, Rita, when you think about the rise of anti-Semitism in this country and how the governments, whether they be federal, state or even councils, are turning a blind eye. You know, we have this situation now where we have citizens who contribute so much to this country who are so scared. I've got so many Jewish friends and they, they're modifying their behaviour. They don't go out as much. They're anxious when their children leave home. This is Australia, for God's sake, and we have got this situation where people are marginalised now because of blind immigration, where people who haven't got the Christian values seem to be taking over. I mean, we are a country that is based on multiculturalism and tolerance and respect, and we now have police failing to step in, obviously because the politicians have told them not to. When we have these anti-Semitic, gas the Jews, these all-powerful, seditious sort of claims that are happening on our streets every week. No wonder the Jews are scared, and no wonder there's a warning not to come here, because frankly, I don't blame them.
Well, of course, there's the imported hatreds, those who've got all sorts of grievances that they've brought to this country. But you look at some of these rallies and it's evident a lot of it is homegrown. And these are people who were born and bred in Australia and the socialists, neo-Marxists, whatever you want to call them. And you see them at plenty of other rallies as well. They don't limit themselves to anti-Israeli sentiment, but that also is a deeply disturbing revelation that we've all had to face in recent weeks. Now, I want to bring you the West Australian's front page today. It's one for the ages. The headline is in response to a shocking story of a known sex offender released from immigration detention after the High Court's contentious landmark NZYQ decision. This man is alleged to have indecently assaulted a woman in a South Australian hotel. Prue, we will not pass judgment on his guilt or innocence. This entire fiasco following the High Court decision just highlights how unprepared the Albanese government is, how chaotic they have been in handling this issue.
It's so scary, isn't it, that we have handed power to these people who are clearly incapable of making the right decisions. They have no judgment. everything's based on politics, and they've got a tin ear. They've lost touch with what the mainstream Australians care about. You know, we care about our national security. We care about the safety of our women and children on the streets. And we care mostly as well that we can feed our kids, that we can keep the lights on, that we can pay our grocery bills. And we have this situation where this government is just chasing the most ridiculous things. I mean, look at the $450 million wasted on The Voice. And all these, you know, they claim that they're actually helping Australians with the cost of living. I don't know anyone who is saying that life has become easier under Albanese. And, you know, they've failed us on so many levels. And I think the fact that this newspaper has chosen this incredibly powerful and so right. I mean, they have actually tuned into what everybody is saying about this country. We are despairing with this country, and they're trying to now, this government's trying to sneak bills, legislation in under cover of the fact that they've left everything so late. They have set us on a course that is going to be very hard to steer into the right path again. You know, we are all despairing, and let's hope they are a one-hit wonder. Let's hope they're thrown out resoundingly with the next election. But in the meantime, they're going to do so much damage.
Prue, there was a protest in Melbourne in the suburb of Elston featuring around 600 women dressed in white. Some of them were carrying signs saying, "Me too, unless you're a Jew." This was in response to, well, many women's rights organisations, feminist commentators, certain politicians who are normally very loud about any hints of misogyny or sexism being silent in the face of the mass sexual violence committed by Hamas that we saw on October 7. Again, it's shameful that a protest like this needs to happen. But where are the feminists? Where are the modern feminists who see rape culture everywhere except where it actually exists?
Well, what a quandary, what a dilemma for these Me Too-ites. You know, the fact that, you know, they normally would, as you say, stand up for anything that was against women, but they're so woke. And they're clearly, you know, their brains, I don't know where they are. They've obviously doused themselves in too much perfume. I don't know what they've done. But, you know, the fact that they're in this conflict now where they have been silent, as the UN women and as the UN has too, that they watch this profound, appalling, you know, the reports that we've seen of what actually happened to the women and what is continuing to happen to the hostages, and there's been absolute silence, and the hypocrisy is deafening, and you just have to say they've lost any credibility whatsoever. They've lost me, they've lost a lot of women, and how dare they? And they cannot be taken seriously ever again.
Well, UN Women finally did put out a statement, but it took them a good 7 weeks, and Prue, that got shamed into doing it. Now, I want to play you a grab of Sky UK host Jonathan Samuels cutting short an interview with an Israeli Defence Force spokesperson. The news anchor was asking about Palestinians not having electricity and access to vital information via their phones when this response had him reeling.
You're telling people where is going to be targeted next. People don't have power to power up their mobile phones. They haven't got Wi-Fi.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think you and all of your viewers saw our hostages being paraded through the streets as they were released to Israel over those 7 nights, and hundreds of Gazans holding their phones, videoing them. So clearly there's enough power to power their phones when they're parading our hostages throughout Gaza. Now that same power to their phones will be to get the maps, download the maps, look at the flyers, and don't forget, we're not only
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm so sorry. We are out of time, but we appreciate your comments this evening.
And Prue, we saw those phones working fine, filming the lynching of those 2 poor young men who were accused of conspiring with Israel. Their brutal treatment was filmed by hundreds, if not thousands of mobile phones. Now, before you go, I've got to ask you about the Sussex's latest drama. It's been reported that Prince Harry and Meghan Markle might lose their royal titles if new laws get the green light. They could go from the Duke and Duchess of Sussex to just plain old Mr. and Mrs. Oh, my goodness. If this legislation that's been proposed is passed in the UK, can you explain a bit more about this story to me? Because I can just see about 20 documentaries, books, sit-down interviews with Oprah if these two are stripped of a royal title. They will not cope.
They won't cope, but who cares if they can cope or not? I think this will resonate with the UK people. We saw Kate got a standing ovation recently when she attended some concert. I think people are so sick of them in the UK, and they shouldn't be rewarded with a title at all. So good on them for having a go. And there was history with this, with the Nazi sympathisers who were noble people after the war, and they were stripped of their nobility in the UK. So let's hope this gets through. I don't know that it will, but it certainly would resonate with, I think, the bulk of the UK people. They have forfeited their right to this privilege.
Prue McSween, always a pleasure. Thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Rita.
Now it's time for Lefties Losing It. Let's start with yet another clip of a narcissist trans activist seeking to intimidate and humiliate a poor working man, an immigrant making a living running a pizza stand. Watch as the activist abuses the worker for misgendering him.
I look like a girl.
I do not understand.
You don't? Do I look like a boy or a girl?
I am?
Me.
I think you're a boy.
No, I'm a girl.
Okay.
Okay. What do you think you look like?
Sour.
No. Just ugly.
Okay.
Oh, it did not end there. He then involves other customers, even offers the slice he's just brought to another customer, costing the poor man business.
Here, you could actually have my pizza. Do you like those?
Yes.
He's so mean I'm not eating his pizza, so you should have it.
Oh, yeah?
Fuck him. You enjoy your pizza.
Thank you.
Bye. Look at him. He's so mean. Do I look like a boy or girl? He's telling me I'm a man. Come on. It doesn't take rocket science.
I'm a man.
He thinks it's funny. Right? It doesn't take rocket science to figure it out.
No.
Thank you. Enjoy your pizza. Bye.
Here's a clue. If you have to keep telling people what you are, perhaps the transformation isn't that convincing. You know, by all means, identify however you want, but bullying and humiliating, intimidating a working man, someone probably working long hours on minimum wage because they misgendered you, is just ugly and gross. And the narcissist wasn't done there yet either. He then attacks the man for being disrespectful and rude.
Bye. I'm just telling you, you have to be more respectful.
Yeah, you are done.
You're not embarrassed to be ignorant and rude?
I am not good English.
I don't buy that for a minute. I think you speak English just fine, my love. Because you understood every other sentence we had.
Great.
Okay, bye. Educate yourself.
You know, on the pizza.
What?
You know.
I would never eat your pizza. In a million years, you're so rude. How are you gonna tell me I'm a man in a purse and long hair and nails?
What a hideous piece of work. Not bad enough calling the poor man ignorant, rude, ugly and much more. He also films the whole thing and posts it for, I don't know, TikTok clout. You would have seen the comments rolling on that clip and all the fans agreeing with him, saying there's 600 people watching and everyone knows who this guy is. I don't know, perhaps he hoped to get the man fired. All this because a dude working at a pizza shop refuses to pander to your delusions, or just simply is confused about the whole thing. And let's have a final look at the narcissist having a meltdown about pronouns.
Asking, well, what are your pronouns? What do you think pronouns are? Take a guess. Take a guess. Well, what were the pronouns of the guy in the pizza shop?
Now to a lefty losing it on Bill Maher's program. This is Democratic strategist James Carville claiming that Speaker Mike Johnson is a bigger threat to America than the mass murdering terrorists of Al-Qaeda. No, really.
Mike Johnson and what he believes is one of the greatest threats we have today to the United States. When I promise you, I know these people.
Well, you're talking about Christian nationalism.
Absolutely.
Talking about
This is a bigger threat than Al-Qaeda to this country. And let me tell you something. They're Speaker of the House. They got probably at least 2 Supreme Court justices, maybe more.
Dave Rubin looking on bemused, or should that be amused? Jimmy Carville is too old to be that stupid. Talking about being too old to be a lefty losing it, let's go to this learned pro-Palestinian protester.
Funny, you don't look Palestinian.
From the nation to the sea, Palestine will be free.
From the nation to the sea?
No, from the mountains to the sea.
From the mountains to the sea?
That's what we want.
From the mountains to the sea?
Yeah.
Which mountains? You don't know, eh? You idiot.
Now, Christmas is around the corner, and if you have any lefties losing it in the family, be prepared, because they are coming armed with wind instruments in case you misgender or dead name them.
So your family thinks they're going to get away with dead naming you and misgendering you this holiday season? No, they're not. You know why? Because you're deranged kazoo kid. You play a wind instrument. You take your mouthpiece and you just anytime the wrong pronouns or the wrong name comes out, and you be obnoxious as shit, because they'll stop real quick.
2 words, disinvite and disinherit. Now, let's learn about pangenderism from this lefty who utilises a triangle to explain the gender spectrum.
So when people talk about gender being a spectrum, most probably picture a line with male on one end and female on the other and non-binary in the middle. But I think a better representation of the spectrum is a triangle with the binary genders, male and female, up there, non-binary genders over there, and agender over here, and most people are going to fall somewhere within this triangle. The prefix pan means, in brief, all. So a pangender person, instead of being inside of this triangle, ends up being a circle around the
She's in the circle around the triangle. What? I mean, forget about being a pansexual. I'm a panahisexual. It's an octagon around the circle, around the triangle, on top of a sphere. It's very, very diverse. And finally, let's end with a look at the Family Guy mocking the wokeification of Christmas celebrations.
First, ethnically accurate Jesus goes right here next to Father Mary and Mother Josephine, followed closely by the 3 genderless wise people on their bird scooters, Tig Notaro for some reason, and of course the little drummer them, because God forbid we call a boy a boy.
The COP28 climate summit is underway in Dubai, and I'm about to bring you some astonishing commentary from Hillary Clinton. We'll get that fact-checked for you. The COP28 is the UN's 2-week climate get-together attended by politicians, policymakers and business leaders from around the world, including the head of the International Monetary Fund, who again spoke about her desire to introduce carbon pricing. Kristalina Georgieva says carbon pricing will accelerate decarbonisation and it is also equitable.
We are a huge proponent of carbon price. We believe that carbon price has the potential of raising revenues in a way that is both equitable, because the more you consume, the more you pollute, the more you pay. And it is also an incentive to accelerate decarbonization. In other words, you would need less money because of consumption and production adapting to it.
Joining me now is energy expert and author of Fossil Future, Alex Epstein. Alex, what would a carbon price mean for the ordinary citizen?
I just wanted to say, yeah, Rita, great to see you again. It's been a while. Yeah, so carbon pricing basically just means taxing. So it means every time you use energy that would normally be cheap, like coal or oil or natural gas, you have to pay more money. And if you want to think about the amount of money that it would take for them to get what they want, consider the fact that Europe already has a de facto huge carbon price. They tax the hell out of fossil fuels. They regulate the hell out of it. These guys want on the order of what they'll call like $1,000 a ton. So adding something like $10 a gallon per gasoline, and even that wouldn't get them what they want. So basically what they want to do is make cheap energy expensive so that we don't use much energy. But if we don't use much energy, then we're going to be really poor. So it's just really, really simple.
And when they talk about decarbonisation, what does that mean for human progress? What does it mean for living standards and also the ability to lift people, in fact, entire countries out of poverty?
Yeah, decarbonization is a kind of euphemism, it just means don't use fossil fuels. But the reason why 80% of the world's energy is fossil fuels, the reason why fossil fuel use is still growing despite all the competition and all the hostility is fossil fuels are uniquely good at providing low-cost, reliable energy for every kind of machine on a scale of billions of people in thousands of places. So at this point in history, decarbonization, since we don't have a near-term alternative, just means de-energizing, which means going back to a manual labor world. And we have billions of people who are using less electricity than a typical US refrigerator. We need more carbonization. We need more empowerment. And that, for the foreseeable future, requires carbonization. And that is infinitely more important. Empowerment is infinitely more important than climate change. Like climate change, you're talking about changing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, little warmer, a little cooler. It doesn't really matter if people have energy. And if people don't have energy, every climate is hell.
Well, according to Hillary Clinton, we're all going to die if we don't decarbonise. She made some remarkable claims about climate change, about climate deaths, and she's also called for gender-responsive climate policy. Let's have a listen.
We're seeing and beginning to pay attention and to count and record the deaths that are related to climate, and by far the biggest killer is extreme heat. I mean, even in Europe last summer, which has the ability to count and figure out what happened, they recorded 61,000 deaths because of the heat in Europe.
But Alex, the latest data I've seen, published in September of this year, in Lancet, mind you, shows that researchers estimate the excess mortality to be around 204,000 deaths attributed to cold and 20,000 attributed to heat annually in Europe. What do you make of Hillary Clinton's commentary there?
I make that there's just still a profound ignorance about a basic fact, which is that climate-related deaths are plummeting. I point out in my book, Fossil Future, and on energytalkingpoints.com, anyone can see the references for free. Climate disaster deaths are down 98% over the last 100 years. And if you want to talk about temperature-related deaths, in particular disaster and non-disaster, cold-related deaths, as you indicated, are a far greater problem than heat-related deaths on every single continent in the world. So what you can see here is just the huge bias that almost everyone on this issue has, which is that they only look for negatives about fossil fuels and they don't look for positives. So they ignore the fact that fossil fuels, insofar as they warm the earth, will obviously save more lives than lives taken away. And the biggest thing is they ignore the energy we get from fossil fuels, which we can't get as cost effectively from anything else, which helps us protect ourselves from every form of climate disaster and danger. That's why the death rate has gone down, because we've used fossil fuel energy to take the naturally dangerous climate and make it unnaturally safe. So Hillary needs to understand fossil fuels are a great thing for the climate, and decarbonization will make the climate deadly and it'll make everything deadly.
Well, at COP28, we've seen Sultan Ahmed Al Jaber facing a storm of criticism for saying there's no science behind the push to phase out fossil fuels. The activists are outraged, Alex. COP28 president also said that this was during a discussion he had with the former Irish President Mary Robinson back in November 21. He also said there is no science out there or no scenario out there that says the phase out of fossil fuels is what's going to achieve 1.5 degrees. And he also argued, Alex, that a fossil fuel phase out would hinder sustainable development unless you want to take the world back into caves. That's an interesting comment there. Timing of it was also very, very fascinating. Well, what do you make of his commentary? And I'm sure there'll be efforts to discredit him and to try to show that he didn't really mean what was said there.
I mean, he was definitely making the right kind of point, which is that anything resembling the rapid elimination of fossil fuels is impossible unless you want the entire world to regress and become poor and become endangered. So really going back to the cave. That's definitely true. Now, if you look at exactly what he said, what he's trying to say is, well, we can use fossil fuels, but we can somehow get rid of the CO2 very soon. And this is basically a farce from all the evidence we have. Maybe you can do that on a local scale, but we have no way of globally capturing all the CO2 in the near future. I mean, one example is in the United States, if you burn $30 worth of coal, right now we subsidize you $150 to put the CO2 underground. Is China going to do that? Is India going to do that? Obviously not. So CO2 capture is nothing resembling a globally scalable thing, which means that, yeah, we need fossil fuels to stay out of the cave, and we need CO2 emissions to stay out of the cave, and we got to get rid of this garbage 1.5 degree or 2 degrees target. This, by the way, is since the 1800s, so it means we can't warm a degree or half a degree. Otherwise, the apocalypse, even though warming a degree corresponds or correlates with the greatest improvement ever, this is just pseudoscience. So get rid of this fear of CO2, get rid of this fear of warming. Just admit fossil fuels are making the world an amazing place. They have some warming impact. It's insignificant compared to the benefits. And to try to get rid of that warming impact now means ruining billions of lives.
You mentioned the US there. We've got the Biden administration continuing to pursue its, extreme green agenda in some areas. There's been a pledge that the US won't construct new coal plants and will shut down existing ones. A special envoy for climate, John Kerry, announced at the summit on Saturday that we will be working to accelerate unabated coal phase out across the world, building stronger economies and more resilient communities. No timeline was given as to when the existing coal plants would be shut down, but what would that mean for American manufacturing, Alex, and for American consumers?
Well, first of all, let's just talk about what this orientation means. I mean, this guy is a fascist, right? He's basically saying I should have total control over the economy. So if I don't like coal plants, I get to shut down coal plants. So that itself is terrifying, that on climate grounds, you can just shut down any industry you want. Now, concretely, I've documented this. If people go to energytalkingpoints.com, search electricity emergency, we're in a catastrophic state in the United States where our grid is shorter than it's been in memory in terms of reliable electricity. So we're lowering the supply of it. We're increasing the demand for it with things like EVs and gas stove bans. And the thing that's preventing us from the abyss is our coal fleet. This is a very reliable fleet. We're totally depending on it. We've shut down too many plants already. We don't have viable replacements coming in the near future. And the Biden administration, despite participating in this catastrophe, wants to just create the apocalypse in terms of just shutting down all our coal plants. And the key is, it's the same thing over and over. They don't look at the benefits of fossil fuels. They just look at the negatives. And when you do that, whether it's with a prescription drug or fossil fuels, you're going to make catastrophic decisions.
Now, I want to get your take on last week's debate between Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida and California Governor Gavin Newsom. At one point, California's high gas prices were brought up and compared to Florida's, which saw Governor Newsom blame it all on big oil price gouging. DeSantis, in response, said it was California's government-dictated green energy policies that are driving up fuel costs. Let's have a quick look.
The average cost for a gallon of gas nationwide, just over $3.24. In Florida, $3.17. In California, it is a whopping $4.85.
And we've been ripped off by big oil. We continue to be ripped off by big oil.
California is the only one that oil companies are gouging. Why aren't they doing that to Georgia or Florida or these other states that have lower gas prices? Because of their policies. That's why people are paying more there. What Gavin Newsom wants to do, what he's doing in California, what Biden wants to do nationally is government-dictated green energy policies.
Alex, California really is a model of what we can expect if governments pursue this green agenda. They're talking about banning cars. You have to be forced to buy an electric car. Energy costs are sky high. Is it all because of government policy, or does Newsom have a point there about big oil price gouging?
He has no point. I mean, I think DeSantis put it out. I mean, basically pointed out this is just a conspiracy belief, right? You think that big oil somehow decided to gouge California, but they're not doing it to the other states. Like, if they wanted to, quote, gouge people, why don't they do it to everyone? And at the same time, Newsom gave more threats to big oil, like, hey, maybe threatening this industry that you depend on is causing higher prices. And I really like Governor DeSantis talking about government dictated green energy policies. I've actually almost never heard anyone besides me use that term. And it's a great term. Every politician should use it because it captures the whole green agenda. It's not about letting new, quote, green technologies compete. It's about dictating them to us, picking winners and losers, and deciding, hey, we are going to try this crazy experiment using only unreliable solar and wind and hope it works. And we're going to ban fossil fuels and restrict nuclear and just hope for the best. And government dictated anything isn't good. And government dictated energy policy that is obsessed and has a fetish with the least effective forms of energy, namely solar and wind at this point, is a total disaster. And I think DeSantis was totally right to name that and to point it out.
Alex Epstein, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Rita. Anytime.
Joining me now is Senior Editor-at-Large at Newsweek, Josh Hammer. Josh, Republicans have slammed Democrat Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal after she called for balanced criticism of the Israel-Hamas war when asked on CNN why so many progressives were silent about Hamas's barbaric assaults against Israeli women, including mass rape and slaughter.
I've seen a lot of progressive women, generally speaking, they're quick to defend women's rights and speak out against using rape as a weapon of war, but downright silent on what we saw on October 7th.
I've condemned what Hamas has done. I've condemned
specifically
all of
women?
the actions. Absolutely.
You turned it back to Israel. I'm asking you about Hamas.
I already answered your question, Dana. I said it's horrific, and I think that rape is horrific, sexual assault is horrific. I think that it happens in war situations. Terrorist organizations like Hamas obviously are using these as tools. However, I think we have to be balanced about bringing in the outrages against Palestinians.
Josh, there were quite a few buts and howevers in that entire exchange that went for a couple of minutes. And as it was pointed out to the Congresswoman during the interview, it's not just a function of conflict. We don't see Israeli soldiers going house to house and raping Palestinian women. Why are so many on the left reluctant to acknowledge what really happened on October 7, including the horrendous treatment of Israeli women?
Rita, unfortunately, that very dark question has an exceedingly straightforward and simple answer, which is that Jew hatred is the world's oldest. It is the original bigotry that mankind developed thousands and thousands of years ago, and tragically, it exists today and is currently in vogue. It is more fashionable than it has ever been. That is obviously what is going on here. The congressman in question here, who is a far-left congresswoman from Washington State, she is pals with AOC. She is pals with Ilhan Omar and the rest of the Jew-hating so-called squad. She referred to Israel as a so-called apartheid state at a far-left conference in Austin, Texas earlier this year. She tried to walk those comments back. Nancy Pelosi was giving her a helping hand and trying to walk those comments back. But it's obvious that there are two separate standards when it comes to Jews and not Jews in the minds of the current woke, addled, leftist Democratic Party. If you are Jewish, then you do not get the benefit of the doubt. By the way, this is the same congresswoman who, along with all of those other names, AOC, Ilhan Omar, Nancy Pelosi, yourself, they were all up in arms, of course, during the Me Too movement. That wasn't that long ago. What happened to believe all women, Rita? What happened to believe all women? Apparently, we have to have an asterisk next to believe all women. Put an asterisk at the bottom of the document that says, unless they are Jewish. If they're Jewish, then no, you automatically side with their genocidal, annihilationist, subjugationist, jihadist foes, not these innocent Jewish women who happen to be Israeli, who happen to live in the Gaza envelope, in the communities near Gaza. It's just disgusting stuff, really. I mean, good for Dana Bash, honestly. You know, credit where credit is due. CNN has not necessarily been, shall we say, the best when it comes to this conflict, but good for her. Good for her for pushing back here. I would have pushed back, frankly, quite a bit further. But this is morally obtuse stuff. It should be discredited. It should be objected to. It should be condemned by any person with any fiber of morality, frankly, in their being.
And you're so right. The very same voices were very outspoken during the Me Too movement. And this particular congresswoman also treated unsubstantiated allegations against Supreme Court Justice nominee Brett Kavanaugh at the time as gospel truth. In fact, she tweeted out, Dr. Blasey Ford, the accuser there, has shown herself to be brave, compelling and absolutely credible. We owe it to her and to sexual assault survivors everywhere to not confirm Kavanaugh. Of course, Kavanaugh was confirmed, but the double standards you mentioned there are apparent over and over again. Now, I want to play you a clip here, incredible really, from a Democrat strategist, James Carville, who launched this astonishing attack against the new leader of the House, Republican Mike Johnson, claiming that he's a Christian nationalist that poses a greater threat to America than terrorist group Al-Qaeda. Here he is on Bill Maher's program.
Mike Johnson and what he believes is one of the greatest threats we have today to the United States. When I promise you, I know these people.
Well, you're talking about Christian nationalism.
Absolutely.
Talking about
This is a bigger threat than Al-Qaeda to this country. And let me tell you something. The Speaker of the House, they got probably at least 2 Supreme Court justices, maybe more.
Josh, I thought James Carville was supposed to be an old school, sensible Democrat. He seems utterly demented there.
Well, he actually might be. I mean, he literally might be senile in his old age. I mean, Jimmy Carville, you know, came to form 30 plus years ago in the 1992 Bill Clinton campaign. Back then, he was a Clinton Democrat, but, you know, he's trying to stay politically relevant just as the rest of the old Democratic Party guard is. You know, Joe Biden is actually a decent analog here. So Joe Biden back in the day was actually pro-life insofar as he called for Roe versus Wade to be overturned. He said that he himself personally was pro-life, was anti-abortion. You know, Joe Biden had any number of other more moderate issues, too. He was a leading proponent of the 1994 crime bill that Bill Clinton signed. All these guys, whether it's Jimmy Carter, whether it's Bill Clinton, they are all now pivoting to try to stay relevant and keep on getting these TV hits like Bill Maher, because otherwise they're just so out of lockstep with the rabid far-left progressive wokerati that comprises today's Democratic Party. And, you know, it really is sad. I fear that Jimmy Carville probably has started to go off the rails. So, you know, he actually teaches a course at Tulane University in New Orleans, and my brother, my only sibling, actually took that course. In fact, my brother was actually Jimmy Carville's token. He's actually his token Republican, his token conservative in the class. They had a nice rapport, those two. That was probably 8 or 9 years ago or so. So I do fear that this probably has only happened in recent years. But at the Democratic Party, just in the post-2017, the post-Trump era, has gone down this ridiculously far-left, culturally hegemonic, oppressive rabbit hole. He's probably just trying to stay relevant because this is total, absolute garbage. Mike Johnson is a Christian who believes in one man, one woman marriage. He believes in the inalienable right to life of the unborn child in the womb and other things that Americans of all political stripes once unanimously agreed upon. His political ideology is right in the middle, frankly, of the Republican caucus. I actually disagree with him when it comes to Ukraine. He's a little more kind of old school, bushy, neoconservative when it comes to conflicts such as that. So I have my own criticisms of Mike Johnson, but the idea that because the man is a self-professed Christian, he is a bigger threat to al-Qaeda, I mean, get the heck out of here, Jimmy Carville. You've totally lost the plot at that point.
Now to the ongoing border crisis in the US. It's certainly hurting President Joe Biden in the polls. NBC News polling shows the GOP now holds an 18-point lead when it comes to handling immigration. And also there's been recent polls, Josh, showing that Donald Trump is eating into Biden's lead among Latino voters. That would be something that would be concerning the Democrats. And we know a lot of those voters care about this issue. We've seen a few Democrats like Eric Adams speak out about the illegal immigration crisis, but does the Biden White House have any intention to tackle this crisis in any meaningful way in the lead up to the 2024 election?
No, on the contrary, they are suing Ken Paxton, Greg Abbott in the state of Texas for Texas's attempts to put some buoys in the Rio Grande, trying to secure Texas's territorial sovereignty against the Mexican drug cartels and, frankly, Hezbollah and some radical Islamic groups that control large swaths, operationally speaking, of the U.S.-Mexico border. So they're actually, not only are they not trying to mitigate the damage, they're actually throwing fuel right into the fire, trying to make it worse. Look, Rita, I think that this is the issue. I think that this right now is the issue that Republicans have to run on right now. By the way, you know, in the 2020 election, when Donald Trump, who was extremely hawkish on the border, obviously, was running for re-election, Republicans made unprecedented gains in very Mexican areas there in the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas. They won multiple counties that were 80, 90% Hispanic there. So this notion that if you talk very tough game on the border and you call for reasonable controls, cracking down on asylum fraud, no to amnesty, all these common sense things, the notion that that will cost you Latino, Hispanic votes is frankly an insult and a slap in the face to many commonsensical Latino and Hispanic voters, many of whom come from traditional Catholic families, actually, as the case may be. So I think that this is really the issue that Republicans should run on. We're coming up here in an election year, going back to what we were just talking about with Speaker Mike Johnson in the House. In the latest episode of my podcast, shameless plug if I may, the Josh Hammer Show, I actually have a segment on the show where I'm giving unsolicited advice to Speaker Johnson and saying that this is the issue, man. Go all in on this issue. Try to pass as much common sense legislation as you can. It is great politics. It is great policy. Alejandro Mayorkas, the Department of Homeland Security Secretary, is way out of his league. Impeachment articles should have been filed against him many months ago, as Andy Biggs of Arizona and other hard-right congressmen have called for. So I am all in on the immigration issue. I think Joe Biden is a dead man walking when it comes to this issue, and I hope that Republicans take advantage of that opportunity.
And finally, Josh, we've got more evidence of this two-tier justice system in America. Two BLM writers charged with burning down a Wendy's restaurant in Atlanta in the summer of 2020, the summer of love. Well, they've been fined just $500 each. It just highlights, Josh, this lack of justice, it appears, in the American justice system.
Yeah, and there's so many examples of this, right? So in New York City and San Francisco and many of these big blue metropolises that all too frequently have Soros prosecutors, as they have in New York City and San Francisco, you also see this trend where the DAs, they literally announce in advance they will not prosecute theft, petty larceny up to a certain dollar amount. So in New York City, I think for a little while, it was under $200. So, what is the incentive at that point? Well, you're going to rob $199 worth of merchandise. I mean, you don't need a PhD or anything to figure out what the incentive structure would get you to do. Same thing here. I mean, incentives matter, Rita. I mean, things like this are obviously going to lead to vastly more crime. They're obviously going to lead to much more larceny, theft, robbery, all sorts of things when it comes to. But ultimately, to go back to what we were saying earlier, the Black Lives Matter movement, of course, is the glittering eye of the left. They love the Black Lives Matter movement, notwithstanding the fact that the Black Lives Matter movement happens to be emphatically pro-Hamas, not just pro-Palestinian. Recall, earlier in the conflict, about 2 months ago now, the BLM Chicago chapter, they actually ended up deleting it, but they had this galling, horrific image of the Hamas paraglider, and they said, that's all you need to know, folks. But again, the Democratic Party has just gone so far off the deep end. They have become so besotted with this toxic ideology of oppressed versus oppressors, of victimizers versus victims, that they hold BLM, despite all that it stands for, out as the quintessence of what it means to be a liberal organization here. Of course, as you know, Rita, if a white Christian were to do the same thing, I don't have to tell you the fine would be substantially worse. Unfortunately, that's the reality.
Absolutely. If you look at what some of the sentences have been of those who participated in the January 6 riots as a comparison. Josh Hammer, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Rita.
Last week, investigative reporter and co-author of the Twitter Files, Michael Shellenberger, provided further testimony alleging that social media platforms conspired with politicians and government agencies to not only engage in mass censorship efforts, but also intentionally spread disinformation to influence elections. On Friday, Shellenberger informed the US House weaponisation of the federal government hearing that the extent of censorship efforts was more severe than even he initially thought.
9 months ago, I testified and provided evidence to the subcommittee about the existence of a censorship industrial complex, a network of government agencies, including the Department of Homeland Security, government contractors, and big tech media platforms that conspired to censor ordinary Americans and elected officials alike for holding disfavored views. I regret to inform the subcommittee today that the scope, power, and law-breaking of the censorship industrial complex are even worse than we had realized back in March. Facebook, X, formerly Twitter, and other big tech companies are privately owned, people point out, and free to censor content. And government officials are free to point out wrong information, they argue. But the First Amendment prohibits the government from abridging freedom of speech. The Supreme Court has ruled that the government may not induce, encourage, or promote private persons to accomplish what is constitutionally forbidden to accomplish. And there's now a large body of evidence proving that the government did precisely that. What's more, the whistleblower who delivered the CTIL files to us says that its leader, a quote-unquote former British intelligence analyst, was quote-unquote in the room at the Obama White House in 2017 when she received the instructions to create a counter-disinformation project to, quote, stop a repeat of 2016.
Joining me now is Michael Shellenberger himself. Michael, you recently co-published a new bombshell report called the CTIL Files, which exposed the extent of this mass online censorship operation. Tell me a little bit about that, and tell me about how the government is using psychological operations and disinformation tactics against their own citizens.
Sure. Well, it's good to be with you, Rita. Good to see you. Yeah, this was very shocking. This was a large trove of documents, a complete set of documents provided to us by a patriotic whistleblower who had access to them. They show that there was much more going on than we thought. It covers a period of time that we had not had a good picture of, which was 2019, 2020. The whistleblower also said that the leader of this organization, it's sort of a supposedly grassroots organization. In truth, they were UK and US military contractors, had started a censorship effort that they tried to hide as a cybersecurity program. They were partly doing cybersecurity, and then they hid within it a censorship initiative. And we know that the person that was in charge of it, according to the whistleblower, said that the idea had come out of the Obama White House in early 2017, before Obama left office. And the idea was not to have a repeat of 2016. We now see other documents showing other government officials working for the government at the time, people working for FBI, people working for the Department of Homeland Security, that were doing the censorship initiative. But it wasn't just that. We actually have a new piece out today that showed that they were actively spreading disinformation. They were doing psychological operations, and that they were considering a much more sweeping program that actually included, and they described in their plans, debanking, which of course we saw Justin Trudeau in Canada use against the truckers. So we're starting to identify what's really a Five Eyes collaboration between the US, Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, where you see these intelligence and security agencies working together to go from counterterrorism last decade to counter-populism, trying to counteract the supposed threat of populists like we saw with Brexit and the election of Trump in 2016.
They are working against their own people. It's astonishing that they would engage in this sort of behaviour. One thing to suppress and censor the free speech of American citizens, but to also be pushing this propaganda. And it's very successful, isn't it, Michael? There'd be many Americans who even today would believe that Russia interfered in the 2016 election, that election was somehow fixed.
That's right. So if you look at it's hard to think about because it's complex, but censorship is one thing, and we saw a lot of censorship, and we saw government proxies, government contractors demanding censorship by the social media platforms of often true information of, say, COVID vaccine side effects or of the lab leak theory of COVID origins. Also of disfavored views, including on the radical left, on the right. But then we also see there were these disinformation campaigns, psychological operations aimed at discrediting the Hunter Biden laptop as Russian disinformation when it wasn't. It was really what it appeared to be. We also saw the disinformation against Trump as supposedly as a Russian asset. We saw the disinformation campaign against the idea of a lab leak of COVID as though it were a conspiracy theory or somehow a fringe idea, when, of course, it was always a very mainstream idea because there have been so many lab leaks before that it was always a realistic scientific hypothesis. And in fact, most people in the United States now think that it did come from a lab. So you're seeing, I think at first we all thought this was just kind of the radical left or the woke left engaging in kind of cancel culture, and that's all that this was. But we're seeing very clearly specific people that were working for the U.S. Navy and also for U.S. military contractors at the time, engaging in these censorship and disinformation operations. So now there's no missing link. There's no speculation. There's no theorizing. These are the actual facts of a secretive effort to break the law, which is by definition a conspiracy.
Where did this come from? How did we get to this position where you've got these institutions, and not just in the US, but you mentioned also the UK, the Five Eyes, including Australia, where these institutions have been captured by one side of the political spectrum, and they're actively working against their own citizens. They're part of an effort to discredit and sometimes even persecute political opponents.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's clearly all part of a single strategy to basically discredit populists, mostly on the right, but also on the left to some extent, but to discredit populism. And so it is, on the one hand, partisan because, of course, Trump was a Republican, so it manifested as an effort mostly on the left with Democrats. But it's really the foreign policy blob or the establishment. I mean, it was all the never Trumpers are sort of in that same group that saw populism as a threat. They thought Brexit and Trump were consequences of social media. You see them very clearly talking in their own in these messages and in other instances of needing to basically exert control over social media. They felt like they had lost control. And they say, look, after World War II, until the rise of social media, the governments could basically control, television, radio. They had this kind of a monopoly control. Social media changed all that. They wanted to get control over social media. But even more than that, I mean, they were just waging psyops. I mean, that sounds like a conspiracy theory. It's true. It was psychological operations aimed at tricking people's brains. And I know I was a victim of some of it. The Hunter Biden laptop, I mean, sometimes it's very straightforward. You have something that's legitimate, but they literally did pre-bunking before the release of the Hunter Biden laptop. They put out misinformation suggesting that there would be Russian misinformation about Hunter Biden related to Burisma, so that when the actual story broke in the New York Post, people were inclined to disbelieve it, and that's how they were manipulating people's minds. And
there are people who still disbelieve it. Some of them are Democrat lawmakers. We've seen independent analysis by the Washington Post, CBS News, New York Times and other outlets confirming the authenticity of the laptop's contents, but you still had a Democrat Congressman, Dan Goldman, try to regurgitate to you the baseless claims that the laptop contents could be manipulated by Rudy Giuliani or the Russians. Let's have a look.
Are you suggesting the New York Post could participate in a conspiracy to construct the contents of the Hunter Biden laptop?
No, sir. The problem is that hard drives can be manipulated by Rudy Giuliani or Russia.
Well, what's the evidence that happened?
Well, there is actual evidence of it, but the point is it's not the same thing.
There's no evidence for it, so you're engaging in a conspiracy.
I'm glad you agree.
Is it frustrating having to explain things that have already been debunked? We already know that entire effort to discredit the laptop and its contents and the Biden family's dodgy business dealings. We all know what that was now, and you're still facing these questions.
I mean, it's amazing because, of course, the Democrats the whole time were saying, oh, that's just a conspiracy theory. And here we're presenting them with files, and it's Twitter files, Facebook files, CTIL, like actual documents, internal documents. And then he goes and presents this wild conspiracy theory for which there has never been any evidence. And there's only been evidence going the other way. I mean, you have to remember when the New York Post published that article, I think it was October 14th of 2020, they provided not only the computer store signature of Hunter Biden on the receipt left at the computer store repair shop that he left the laptop at, and the New York Post published the FBI subpoena for the laptop from him. So we knew right away there was like documentation. In fact, Twitter's own internal staff evaluated the New York Post article, and they said there's no evidence that this was a result of a Russian hack and leak operation. So to have a sitting member of Congress 3 years later, over 3 years later, continue to perpetuate a conspiracy theory without any evidence of that. I mean, he's claimed, oh, there is evidence. No, there wasn't. All he said is, oh, maybe something happened that we don't know about. That is literally the definition of conspiracy theorizing. I mean, it's really, you can't make it up. The Democrats, I think they went too far. I mean, they had just tried to ignore us the entire hearing and talk about Trump. And then Daniel Goldman couldn't help himself. He had to pick a fight with me. But obviously he had nothing. And I just think they get so wrapped up in their own ideology, they don't even know that they're like engaging in that kind of magical thinking anymore.
Now, Michael, you're part of a new documentary called the Censorship Files. Let's have a quick look.
If the Supreme Court says that the government can coerce, pressure, work with tech companies to censor speech, I don't think that the First Amendment has any meaning anymore.
Especially when you have a crisis situation that you need the First Amendment.
The so-called counter-disinformation units have basically become counter-dissent units. The powers of the state and Silicon Valley are merging.
Today, American taxpayers are unwittingly financing the growth and power of a censorship industrial complex.
I saw Martin Kulldorff there, the Harvard infectious disease expert who was silenced, suppressed, defamed also for warning about our COVID response. He's been proven to be 100% right on just about everything. And he was 100% right in that clip we just saw where he said the First Amendment is most important during a crisis, but it was effectively suspended during COVID.
That's right. I mean, he just makes such a good point, which is that, free speech is not this kind of nice to have thing. Oh, we'll have it when the government decides to have it. No, free speech is in the United States is an inalienable right. It's a fundamental freedom. It's a fundamental human right. And it's not something that you're allowed to suspend when things are difficult. Like that's what we've been seeing the politicians doing every time. They just they want to censor. And so they just find more things that they're going to call a crisis, whether it's COVID or climate change or racism or whatever. They're just going to invent new justifications. And we're having in Ireland, you see in Australia on the Indigenous ballot. I mean, they're just going to invent new justifications for censoring people that they don't like. Now, on the one hand, you kind of go, that just looks like wokeism, but really, we now know it's part of a much more sophisticated and terrifying governmental, international governmental operation by the military and intelligence and security agencies to try to counter populist voices. And it's just outrageous. It's terrifying. It should infuriate everybody that wants to decide for ourselves. It's not just that our ability to speak for our own voice, Rita, but it's also our right to hear each other. It's my right to hear you. You know, it's our right to have a conversation. The government is, it's so out of control and inappropriate. This needs to be shut down. It needs to be defunded. There needs to be an investigation across the Five Eyes countries. We do not want the police and these intelligence and security agencies telling us what we can and cannot say online. It has to stop, and we're going to keep the fight going. The documentary is going to come out early next year. I hope people sign up on the list for at X or at Substack, and they'll be the first ones to see it.
Michael Shellenberger, thank you so much for your time today. You are doing such crucial work, and we look forward to speaking to you again.
Thanks, Rita. It's good to be with you.
And that's it for the Rita Panahi Show Overtime. We'll be back bigger and better in 2024. But I'll see you Friday for the regular Rita Panahi Show and Sunday morning for Outsiders.